The most dangerous people are usually the ones nobody remembers seeing. The command deck of the starship Resolute never truly slept. Even during the artificial night cycle, hundreds of holographic displays illuminated the bridge in shades of blue and silver. Navigation data flowed across transparent screens. Fleet reports updated every few seconds. Officers moved between stations with practiced precision. Above them, distant stars drifted across the massive observation windows like slow rivers of light. It was one of the most advanced warships in the Varan Imperial Fleet, and somewhere aboard its 12-mile-long structure worked a man almost nobody noticed. Daniel Hayes sat quietly at a secondary logistics terminal near the rear of the command deck. His gray service uniform carried no impressive decorations, no ceremonial insignias, no symbols of distinction. Most officers passed by his station without a second glance. Some assumed he was a clerk. Others thought he handled inventory reports. A few did not know his name at all. Daniel never seemed bothered by it. He reviewed cargo manifests with the same concentration other officers reserved for military strategy. He checked maintenance schedules, supply routes, emergency reserves, quiet work, invisible work, the kind of work people only noticed when it was missing. A young communications officer hurried past his station carrying a stack of digital reports. One file slipped from her hands. Before it reached the floor, Daniel caught it without looking away from his screen. "Thank you," she said. Daniel smiled politely. "You are welcome." Then he returned to his work. The interaction lasted less than 5 seconds. By lunchtime, she had already forgotten it happened. That was how life aboard the Resolute worked. The spotlight belonged elsewhere. Commander Lyra Voss stood at the center of the bridge beneath a ring of floating tactical displays. Her royal blue skin reflected the cool glow of holographic maps. Silver-white hair rested neatly across her uniform collar. Every movement carried confidence. Every order carried authority. She had earned her reputation through discipline, intelligence, and relentless dedication. Officers respected her. Some even feared disappointing her. Today, however, frustration clouded her expression. Several fleet exercises had produced inconsistent supply forecasts. Nothing catastrophic, nothing dangerous, but enough to irritate a commander responsible for thousands of personnel. Lyra reviewed another report and frowned. Why are these resource projections delayed? An aide checked the system. The logistics department requested additional verification before submitting final numbers. Lyra folded her arms. Verification should not require this much time. Her gaze moved toward the rear section of the bridge, toward Daniel's workstation. The human calmly continued reviewing data, seemingly unaffected by the tension surrounding him. One of the senior officers lowered his voice. The request originated from Hayes. Lyra glanced toward Daniel again. The human. "Yes, Commander." Her expression tightened slightly. "Then perhaps the delay explains itself." Several nearby officers exchanged quiet smiles. Daniel had developed a reputation for caution, thoroughness, double-checking details others considered obvious. In a military culture that prized speed and decisiveness, such habits often appeared outdated. Daniel overheard the conversation. He simply continued working. Outside the observation windows, stars drifted silently across the darkness. Inside the bridge, the fleet prepared for another series of strategic operations. Nobody paid attention to the human reviewing cargo records in the back corner. Nobody noticed how many officers unknowingly relied on procedures he had written years earlier. Nobody wondered why a man with such experience seemed content performing work that attracted no recognition. On the Resolute, Daniel Hayes had become part of the background. Reliable, quiet, forgettable. And at that moment, not a single person aboard the flagship realized they were walking past one of the most remarkable service records ever created in human history. The next morning began with the sound of engines. Deep, constant, like distant thunder trapped inside metal walls. The Resolute drifted through a corridor of stars while thousands of crew members started another duty cycle. On the command deck, officers moved between stations carrying reports, tactical projections, and supply forecasts. The atmosphere felt efficient, controlled. Yet beneath the surface, Commander Lyra Voss remained irritated. The delayed logistics report from the previous day had finally reached her desk. She reviewed the numbers while standing beneath a floating display that stretched nearly 10 feet across. Every calculation appeared precise. Every reserve estimate matched projected consumption. Every contingency plan accounted for scenarios other departments had overlooked. The report was excellent. That somehow annoyed her even more. "Who finalized this?" she asked. An operations officer checked the authorization record. "Daniel Hayes, Commander." Lyra stared at the name. Again, the officer nodded carefully. "His department has not submitted an inaccurate forecast in 7 years. Accuracy is not the issue." Lyra closed the report. "Speed is." Around the bridge, several officers quietly agreed. Daniel's reputation was well established. He questioned assumptions, requested verification, rechecked information others considered complete. Younger officers often described him as cautious. Older officers sometimes called him stubborn. Few considered those traits strengths. At the rear of the command deck, Daniel continued his work without noticing the discussion. Or perhaps he noticed and simply chose not to react. His terminal displayed cargo movement schedules spanning hundreds of vessels. Thousands of variables flowed across the screen. He studied them patiently, one line at a time, one detail at a time. The method seemed slow, yet mistakes rarely survived his attention. Several hours later, the senior command staff gathered for a strategic planning session. The conference chamber overlooked a panoramic section of space illuminated by distant nebulae. Commander Lyra stood at the center of the room while department representatives presented updates. Tactical divisions reported readiness levels. Engineering teams discussed maintenance schedules. Communications officers reviewed diplomatic traffic. Finally, logistics received its turn. Daniel entered carrying a simple digital tablet. No dramatic presentation. No elaborate visuals. Just information. He calmly explained projected supply requirements for upcoming operations. Estimated fuel expenditures. Emergency reserve thresholds. The presentation lasted less than 10 minutes. When he finished, silence followed. Not because anyone was impressed. Because nobody had questions. The numbers were complete. The analysis was thorough. Everything appeared resolved. Lyra folded her arms. "You delayed submission of this report by 9 hours." Daniel nodded. "Yes, Commander." "Why?" "The initial projections contained an inconsistency." "A significant inconsistency?" "Potentially." "Potentially." Lyra's tone sharpened. "You held an entire fleet report because of a possibility?" Daniel met her gaze without defensiveness. "Because possibilities become problems when ignored." Several officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The room felt colder. Lyra looked unconvinced. "Military operations require decisiveness." "Agreed." "Then perhaps excessive caution is not always useful." Daniel remained silent for a moment. Perhaps. The answer somehow frustrated her more than an argument would have. No challenge. No excuse. No attempt to defend himself. Just quiet acceptance. After the meeting ended, officers filed from the chamber. Conversations resumed. Plans continued. Yet Lyra remained standing beside the observation window. Far below, stars drifted through darkness. One of her advisors approached cautiously. "You seem dissatisfied." Lyra watched Daniel disappear down the corridor, carrying his tablet. "He works hard." "Yes." "His reports are accurate." "Yes." "Then why does it feel like he belongs to another era?" The advisor considered the question. "Perhaps because he does not seem interested in proving himself." Lyra frowned slightly. Most ambitious officers spent their careers seeking recognition, promotion, influence. Daniel seemed content remaining invisible. To her, that looked less like confidence and more like a lack of initiative. And as the massive starship continued its journey through the darkness, Commander Lyra became increasingly convinced that the quiet human working in logistics might be the weakest member of her command staff. 3 days later, the Resolute entered the outer boundary of the Kareth expanse. The region appeared peaceful on navigational charts. Endless darkness stretched between distant stars. Thin clouds of silver gas drifted across space like frozen rivers. Yet every officer aboard the flagship knew the sector carried risks. Long-distance supply routes crossed through the expanse. Communication delays were common. Navigation systems occasionally produced conflicting readings. Nothing dangerous enough to cause alarm. Just enough uncertainty to demand attention. On the command deck, holographic displays filled the air with shifting streams of data. Commander Lyra Voss stood beneath a tactical projection nearly 15 feet wide. Around her, Senior officers reviewed operational plans for the fleet's upcoming transit. Everything seemed routine, until an alert appeared. A yellow indicator flashed across several displays simultaneously. Then another. Then three more. Confused officers exchanged glances. Sensor synchronization error, one technician reported. Multiple cargo vessels are transmitting conflicting position data. Lyra frowned. How many? Currently 12. Within minutes, the number increased to 27. Then 41. The bridge atmosphere changed immediately. Officers moved faster. Voices grew sharper. Additional screens activated across the command deck. The fleet remained safe, but something was clearly wrong. Several specialists began analyzing the problem. Their conclusions varied. Some blamed communications interference. Others suspected navigation drift. A few proposed software irregularities. None of the explanations fully matched the available evidence. Lyra listened carefully before making a decision. I want updated projections within the hour. A chorus of acknowledgments followed. Everyone hurried to their assignments. Everyone except Daniel Hayes. He remained seated at his terminal, studying the incoming reports with the same quiet focus he always displayed. One officer noticed him. Hayes, do you have an assessment? Daniel reviewed another data stream before answering. Not yet. The officer sighed. Of course. The response carried a hint of irritation. Daniel ignored it. Hours passed. The discrepancy continued spreading through fleet systems. More cargo routes displayed inconsistencies. Resource allocations began falling out of alignment. Nothing catastrophic had occurred, yet the uncertainty itself created problems. Operations depended on reliable information, and reliable information was becoming increasingly difficult to find. Late in the day, Commander Lyra convened an emergency review meeting. Department heads filled the conference chamber. Holographic projections illuminated anxious faces. Every specialist presented findings. Every team offered recommendations. None provided certainty. Finally, Lyra looked toward Daniel. Your department? The room became unusually quiet. Daniel stood. His digital tablet remained tucked beneath one arm. The position errors are not random. Several officers exchanged skeptical looks. We already know that, someone muttered. Daniel continued calmly. The pattern originates from a resource tracking relay network established 18 years ago. Silence followed. Several technicians immediately checked their displays. Expressions changed. One by one, they confirmed the observation. The pattern matched. Lyra narrowed her eyes. Why was this not identified earlier? Daniel answered honestly. Nobody was looking that far back. The room grew uncomfortable. The statement was not an accusation. Somehow that made it worse. Lyra folded her arms. Can the issue be corrected? Yes. How long? Daniel considered the data. If we begin immediately, approximately 6 hours. Relief spread across the chamber. Yet before anyone could celebrate, Daniel added one final sentence. If we wait until tomorrow, the correction will require several days. The room became silent again. Lyra stared at him. The human she increasingly viewed as outdated had identified the source of a fleet-wide problem in less than a day. Yet instead of feeling impressed, she felt something else. Frustration. Because every time Daniel solved a problem, he somehow reinforced her belief that he approached command matters the wrong way. Too cautious. Too slow. Too focused on old systems. As officers rushed to implement the solution, Lyra watched the human return quietly to his workstation. Around him, people hurried, celebrated, solved crises. Daniel simply sat down and resumed working. And although the fleet problem would soon disappear, another decision was already forming in the commander's mind. A decision that would change both of their lives before the week was over. The decision came 2 days later. The stars outside the Resolute appeared unusually bright, scattered across the darkness like fragments of shattered crystal. Inside the flagship, however, the atmosphere felt colder than usual. Officers moved through corridors carrying reports and tactical updates, unaware that a quiet administrative action was about to change the direction of the entire fleet. Daniel Hayes arrived on the command deck at the beginning of his shift. He carried the same digital tablet, wore the same gray uniform, occupied the same workstation near the rear of the bridge. Everything appeared normal for exactly 23 minutes. Then a notification appeared on his terminal. Personnel reassignment authorized. Daniel read the message once, then a second time. His expression never changed. Nearby officers continued working without noticing. Several minutes later, a command aide approached his station. "Commander Voss would like to see you." Daniel nodded. Of course. The command chamber overlooked a vast section of open space. Nebula light reflected across the transparent walls, painting the room in shades of blue and silver. Commander Lyra stood beside a tactical display when Daniel entered. She did not immediately speak. The silence stretched for several seconds. Finally, she turned toward him. "Please sit." Daniel remained standing. "I am comfortable here." Lyra folded her hands behind her back. "Very well." She activated a personnel report. His file appeared between them. Basic service information. Department history. Assignment records. Nothing unusual. Nothing remarkable. At least, nothing she considered relevant. "I have reviewed the structure of my command staff," she began, "and I believe certain departments require modernization." Daniel listened quietly. "Your methods are thorough," Lyra continued. "Your work is accurate. However, the fleet increasingly operates in fast-moving environments." Daniel nodded slightly. "Understood." The response caught her off guard. She had expected questions, perhaps even disagreement. Instead, she received simple acknowledgement. Lyra continued. "Effective immediately, you will be reassigned from strategic logistics support to civilian supply coordination aboard Station 12. The room became silent. Outside the observation window, distant stars drifted past. Daniel looked at the transfer order, then back toward the commander. "I understand." That was all. No defense. No explanation. No mention of the countless reports he had completed. No reminder that he had solved the fleet synchronization problem only days earlier. Just quiet acceptance. Somehow that made the conversation more uncomfortable. Lyra straightened her posture. "The reassignment is not disciplinary. I never assumed it was. Your experience may still prove useful there." Daniel offered a polite smile. "Then I will do my best." For the first time, uncertainty touched Lyra's expression. She could not explain why. She had made a reasonable command decision. Yet something about the human's reaction felt strangely heavy. Daniel saluted respectfully. "If there is nothing further, Commander." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "You are dismissed." Minutes later, Daniel returned to his workstation. Several officers glanced toward him as he quietly packed his belongings. The process took less than 10 minutes. One tablet, a few storage drives, a worn notebook with physical pages. Nothing else. A young communications officer approached cautiously. "Are you leaving?" Daniel smiled. "Looks that way." "I am sorry to hear that." "Thank you." She seemed ready to say more, but could not find the words. Daniel simply wished her a good shift and continued toward the exit. The doors closed behind him with a soft mechanical sound. Around the bridge, work resumed almost immediately. Reports continued flowing. Orders continued arriving. The flagship moved forward through the darkness exactly as before. Yet as Daniel walked alone through the corridor toward the transport docks, neither he nor Commander Lyra realized that the fleet had just removed the one person who understood a coming crisis before it even appeared. And somewhere deep within forgotten military archives, records older than most civilizations remained silent for now, waiting for someone to finally ask who Daniel Hayes really was. Station 12 orbited a pale blue gas giant nearly 300,000 miles from the nearest fleet route. Compared to the Resolute, the station felt quiet. Smaller. Slower. Civilian cargo vessels arrived throughout the day carrying agricultural supplies, medical equipment, industrial materials, and passengers traveling between frontier systems. Life here revolved around schedules and shipments rather than strategy and command. Daniel Hayes adapted immediately. 3 days after his transfer, he already knew the names of most dock supervisors. He helped repair inventory discrepancies, reorganized storage allocations, improved cargo routing efficiency without being asked. The work was simple, useful, familiar, exactly the kind of work he had always preferred. Meanwhile, aboard the Resolute, Commander Lyra Voss felt increasingly confident in her decision. The logistics division continued operating. Reports arrived on time. Department heads seemed satisfied. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, at least at first. The first sign of trouble appeared during a routine fleet readiness review. Several supply forecasts contained small inconsistencies. Nothing alarming. Tiny discrepancies hidden within larger calculations. Analysts adjusted the figures and moved on. Then more discrepancies appeared. Fuel allocation estimates no longer matched transportation schedules. Reserve inventories fluctuated unexpectedly. Cargo routing predictions began producing conflicting outcomes. Again, none of the issues seemed critical individually. Together, however, they created a growing sense of uncertainty. Lyra called an emergency coordination meeting. Specialists from multiple departments gathered around a circular conference table illuminated by holographic displays. The atmosphere felt tense. "How long until we identify the source?" Lyra asked. Silence followed. Several officers exchanged uneasy looks. Finally, one analyst answered, "We are still reviewing the data. Still, the inconsistencies do not follow expected patterns." Another officer spoke carefully. "We keep correcting one issue and discovering another." Frustration spread across the room. Hours became days. The fleet remained operational, but confidence in the numbers continued eroding. Every decision required additional verification. Every projection required reanalysis. Work slowed. Meetings multiplied. The command staff found themselves spending more time checking information than acting on it. One evening, a young logistics officer remained alone in the records department after most personnel had left for the night cycle. Exhausted, she searched through archive procedures hoping to identify a pattern everyone else had missed. Thousands of files filled the database. Years of operational records stretched back through multiple administrations. As she compared old reports against current projections, she noticed something strange. Certain validation protocols no longer existed. Entire verification chains had disappeared from recent workflows. Curious, she traced the records backward. The procedures all originated from one source. Daniel Hayes. The officer frowned. She opened additional files. More protocols appeared. Resource balancing systems. Emergency reserve calculations. Long-range supply correction models. Again and again, the same name surfaced. Daniel Hayes. Confusion replaced fatigue. If his procedures were so common, why had nobody mentioned him during the crisis? She continued searching. Then she discovered something even stranger. Many officers used systems Daniel originally designed without realizing he created them. Several departments depended on frameworks he had maintained for years. The officer immediately forwarded her findings to senior command. By morning, the report reached Commander Lyra's desk. Lyra reviewed the document while standing alone on the bridge. The stars outside seemed unusually distant. The report revealed a troubling possibility. Since Daniel's departure, numerous interconnected systems had gradually drifted away from the standards he personally monitored. Nobody had noticed because the changes occurred slowly, quietly, the way most important problems begin. Lyra stared at the name appearing repeatedly throughout the report. Daniel Hayes. For the first time, doubt entered her thoughts. Not about his competence, about her judgment. Outside the observation window, the fleet continued its journey through the darkness. Inside the flagship, officers worked desperately to understand problems that seemed to multiply faster than solutions. And somewhere aboard a distant civilian station, the man everyone considered replaceable remained completely unaware that the first cracks were beginning to appear in the command structure he had quietly supported for years. Commander Lyra Voss had not slept well in 6 days. The evidence kept accumulating. Every report arriving on her desk pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The fleet's growing logistical instability was not caused by a major system failure. It was caused by the absence of one person. The realization irritated her more than she cared to admit. Outside the command deck windows, distant stars drifted across the darkness. Inside the flagship, officers worked through another cycle of revisions and corrections. Supply projections required constant adjustment. Reserve calculations needed repeated verification. Small inconsistencies continued appearing in places no one expected. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Yet the efficiency of the entire fleet had begun to erode. During an emergency review meeting, a senior analyst activated a series of archived records. Holographic displays filled the conference chamber. Years of operational data appeared above the table. "Commander," the analyst said carefully, "there is something you need to see." Lyra folded her arms. "Go ahead." The analyst highlighted several major fleet operations from previous years. Long-range deployments. Humanitarian support missions. Frontier resupply campaigns. Every operation displayed exceptional efficiency ratings. Every operation shared one common detail. Daniel Hayes had supervised logistics verification. Another analyst stepped forward. We expanded the search. Additional records appeared. More missions. More fleet actions. More successful operations. Again, the same name surfaced. Daniel Hayes. Silence spread through the room. Lyra frowned. How many years do these records cover? 22 years. Several officers exchanged surprised looks. 22 years represented an unusually long service history for someone occupying a relatively minor support role. The analysts continued searching deeper into archived databases. One of them paused unexpectedly. Commander. His voice sounded different, almost confused. There is a restricted file attached to his personnel record. Lyra looked up immediately. Restricted by whom? The authorization level predates current fleet administration. That answer made no sense. Most personnel files remained straightforward. Service history, promotions, training records. Nothing unusual. Yet Daniel's file contained security protocols older than many command systems currently in use. Open it, Lyra ordered. The analyst attempted access. The system denied the request. Another attempt failed. Finally, a senior archivist joined the effort. Ancient authorization chains unfolded across the display. Layers of encrypted documentation emerged one after another. The room became increasingly quiet. Nobody expected a logistics officer to possess a file requiring this level of protection. Then the archive opened. A single emblem appeared. Several older officers immediately froze. One actually stood from his chair. That cannot be real. Lyra stared at the symbol. She recognized it from military history courses. The emblem belonged to the Terran Expeditionary Command, a legendary human organization that had ceased operations decades earlier. Continue, she said. The archivist swallowed nervously. Service history expanded across the screen. Mission records, commendations, strategic assignments. Entire sections remained classified even now. Every new line deepened the silence. The young analysts looked stunned. Veteran officers looked pale. One historian attached to Fleet Command slowly removed his glasses and stared at the display. Commander, he whispered, I know this name. Lyra turned toward him. How? Because every cadet studies some of these operations. The historian pointed toward the records. We thought the commanding officers became legends. His voice lowered. We never knew he was still alive. Nobody spoke. The room felt frozen. Years of assumptions began collapsing at once. The quiet human assigned to a forgotten workstation near the back of the bridge suddenly appeared very different. Not because he had changed, because they were finally seeing him clearly. Lyra stared at the file while a strange feeling settled over her. For the first time since Daniel's transfer, she was no longer asking whether she had underestimated him. She was beginning to wonder how an entire fleet had failed to recognize who had been standing beside them all along. The conference chamber remained silent long after the archive finished loading. Holographic displays floated above the table, casting pale blue light across stunned faces. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The records hanging in the air felt less like personnel files and more like pieces of forgotten history. Commander Lyra Voss stared at the name she thought she understood. Daniel Hayes. The same quiet human who spent his mornings reviewing supply manifests and correcting inventory forecasts now appeared at the center of operations studied in military academies across multiple civilizations. The historian standing beside the display slowly activated another section of the archive. Commander, he said quietly, there is something else. Additional records appeared. Hundreds of pages. Mission summaries. Recognition orders. Preservation directives. Most officers could barely process the volume of information. Then one statistic emerged near the center of the display. Several analysts immediately noticed it. A young lieutenant blinked twice, convinced she had misread the number. 12,000. Another officer leaned forward. That cannot be correct. The historian carefully opened the associated documentation. Silence deepened throughout the room. For years, rumors had circulated about legendary figures from the final decades of the Terran Expeditionary Command. Stories changed with every retelling. Details blurred with time. Yet the official records remained clear. The number attached to Daniel Hayes was not a combat statistic. It was something else entirely. The screen displayed a designation recognized by every military historian present. Confirmed lives preserved through operational command. Total, 12,000. Nobody spoke. The number seemed impossible. Yet every supporting document verified it. Across decades of service, Daniel had coordinated evacuations, supply corridors, rescue operations, disaster responses, and emergency logistics during some of the most difficult periods in interstellar history. 12,000 individuals remained alive because decisions he made allowed resources to arrive where they were needed most. The room felt different now. One analyst sat down slowly. Another removed his glasses and stared at the display. The figure carried a weight that no metal could match. Commander Lyra looked toward another section of the archive. Why was this hidden? The historian answered carefully. Because he requested it. Several officers turned toward him. Requested it. The historian nodded. According to these records, he declined public recognition repeatedly. More files appeared. Promotion offers. Honorary appointments. Public commendations. Again and again, Daniel refused them. Each rejection carried nearly identical language. Service completed. Recognition unnecessary. The word seemed almost unreal. Most officers spent entire careers pursuing distinction. Daniel had spent decades avoiding it. Lyra felt a growing discomfort she could no longer ignore. Memories resurfaced. The logistics reports. The quiet recommendations. The patience she interpreted as hesitation. The caution she considered outdated. Every assumption now looked different. A communications officer entered the conference chamber carrying an urgent update. Commander. Lyra looked up. What is it? The fleet synchronization problems continue expanding. Several officers immediately returned their attention to operational displays. The situation remained manageable, but barely. More systems required correction. More projections required verification. Valuable time continued slipping away. The irony settled heavily over the room. The fleet was struggling to solve problems once managed effortlessly by the very person they had reassigned. Lyra stared at Daniel's file one last time. Then she made a decision. Prepare a transport. Several officers looked surprised. Commander? Lyra closed the archive display. I am going to Station 12. No one questioned her. Because for the first time since Daniel Hayes left the Resolute, Commander Lyra no longer viewed him as a former subordinate. She viewed him as someone she needed to understand. And somewhere beneath the artificial lights of a distant civilian station, the human whose choices had quietly protected 12,000 lives continued organizing cargo schedules, completely unaware that an entire fleet had finally begun discovering who he truly was. Station 12 was quieter than most military installations. The loudest sounds came from cargo loaders moving containers across docking platforms and transport shuttles arriving from distant trade routes. There were no grand strategy meetings, no tactical briefings, no endless streams of military reports. Daniel Hayes seemed perfectly comfortable with that. On the morning Commander Lyra arrived, he was standing beside a warehouse terminal helping two civilian coordinators solve a scheduling conflict involving agricultural shipments. His gray uniform looked exactly the same as it had aboard the Resolute. Simple, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The transport carrying Lyra touched down shortly after sunrise. Through the station's transparent observation dome, the pale blue gas giant filled half the sky. Its swirling clouds reflected soft light across the docking bay. Several station administrators hurried forward to greet the commander's arrival. Lyra acknowledged them politely, but wasted little time. Where is Daniel Hayes? One administrator pointed toward a distant cargo platform. Warehouse 4. Lyra followed the direction. When she finally saw him, the moment felt strangely ordinary. Daniel stood beside a stack of supply containers holding a digital tablet. He listened patiently while two workers explained a routing problem. Then he offered a suggestion. Both workers smiled immediately. The issue appeared resolved. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet something about it lingered in Lyra's thoughts. The same man who once coordinated operations affecting entire sectors now spent his time helping station crews organize freight deliveries. And somehow he seemed content. Daniel noticed her approaching. Surprise crossed his face for only a moment. Then he smiled politely. Commander. Lyra stopped a few feet away. For the first time since meeting him, she found herself uncertain what to say. Mr. Hayes. Daniel glanced toward the workers. Would you excuse me? They quickly departed. Silence settled between them. Cargo shuttles moved in the distance. Automated loaders hummed softly across the docking platform. Finally, Lyra spoke. I reviewed your service record. Daniel's expression remained unchanged. I see. Why did you never tell anyone? The question escaped more quickly than she intended. Daniel looked toward the giant planet beyond the observation dome. Tell them what? Lyra stared at him. You know exactly what. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. People rarely ask. The answer frustrated her. 12,000 lives. Daniel lowered his eyes briefly. Approximately. Approximately. Lyra could barely believe what she was hearing. Most officers would spend their entire careers talking about accomplishments like that. Daniel's smile faded slightly. The people who were helped mattered more than the person who helped them. The words landed with unexpected force. No arrogance. No pride. Just simple truth. Lyra found herself remembering every assumption she had made. Every judgment. Every moment, she viewed him as outdated. I reassigned you, she said quietly. Yes. I was wrong. Daniel studied her face for a moment. Then he surprised her again. Everyone is wrong sometimes. No resentment. No bitterness. No attempt to make her feel guilty. Somehow that made the apology harder to give. Lyra looked away briefly. Beyond the dome, distant stars glittered against the darkness. The fleet needs your help. Daniel remained silent. The logistical problems are spreading. I suspected they might. Lyra almost laughed from disbelief. Of course you did. Daniel looked toward the workers moving supplies across the station. Did you come all this way just to apologize? For the first time in many days, Lyra smiled. A genuine smile. No, she met his eyes. I came to ask for your help. The human considered the request carefully. Around them, station life continued as normal. Cargo moved. Lights flashed. Engines hummed. Yet in that quiet moment, Commander Lyra realized something important. The most remarkable thing about Daniel Hayes was not what he had accomplished. It was that none of those accomplishments had changed the way he treated people. And as the stars shimmered beyond the observation dome, she waited for his answer with more respect than she had ever offered anyone before. Daniel Hayes returned to the Resolute 3 days later. There was no ceremony, no formal announcement, no audience waiting in the command hangar. He arrived aboard a standard transport shuttle carrying the same digital tablet and the same worn notebook he had taken with him when he left. The difference was not in Daniel. The difference was in how people looked at him. Officers who once passed without noticing now paused when he entered a room. Conversations quieted. Some watched with curiosity, others with admiration, a few with disbelief. Daniel responded to all of them exactly the same way he always had, with a polite nod and a calm smile. On the command deck, Commander Lyra Voss stood beside the primary tactical display as senior officers gathered around a series of increasingly complicated logistics projections. The problems had continued growing during the previous weeks. Resource forecasts no longer aligned properly. Transportation schedules conflicted with reserve calculations. Every correction seemed to create another inconsistency somewhere else. Daniel studied the displays in silence. He reviewed reports, compared historical records, examined system interactions stretching back years. Nearly an hour passed before he finally spoke. The issue is not the data. Several officers exchanged confused looks. Then what is it? One analyst asked. Daniel activated a new display. Hundreds of interconnected procedures appeared across the room. The problem is that everyone has been correcting symptoms instead of causes. He highlighted several pathways, then several more. Slowly, the pattern became visible. Departments had modified procedures independently over time. Small changes, reasonable changes, efficient changes. Yet nobody had tracked how those changes affected the larger system. The result resembled a machine whose individual parts worked perfectly while the whole machine drifted out of alignment. The room grew quiet. Daniel spent the next several hours rebuilding the framework step by step. Not by replacing people, not by criticizing decisions, simply by reconnecting systems that once worked together. By evening, the first corrected projections appeared, then the second, then dozens more. For the first time in weeks, the numbers aligned. Reserve estimates stabilized. Supply forecasts matched operational plans. Confidence returned to the command staff. Relief spread through the flagship like sunlight after a storm. Yet the moment that remained in memory did not happen during the repairs. It happened later, much later. Near the end of the cycle, Commander Lyra assembled the senior officers on the command deck. The stars beyond the observation windows shone brightly against the darkness. The bridge fell silent as she stepped forward. "There is something I need to say." Every officer listened. Lyra turned toward Daniel. "Many of us benefited from work we did not fully understand." The room remained still. Many of us relied upon dedication we failed to appreciate. Daniel looked uncomfortable already, which made several officers smile. Lyra continued, "And some of us made judgments before learning the full truth." Her gaze met his. "I know I did." No one spoke. The silence carried respect, not obligation, not protocol. Respect. Lyra inclined her head slightly. It was a small gesture, yet coming from a fleet commander, it meant everything. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." Daniel looked around the bridge. At the officers. At the stars. At the people who finally understood what kind of man had been standing among them all along. Then he smiled softly. "You are welcome." Nothing more. No speech. No acceptance of praise. No attempt to claim credit. The moment passed quietly, exactly the way he preferred. Hours later, after most officers had left the bridge, Daniel remained near the observation window. Outside, endless stars filled the darkness. Commander Lyra paused before leaving. "After everything you have done," she asked quietly, "why did you never want recognition?" Daniel watched the stars for several seconds. "Because the goal was never to be remembered." Lyra waited. Daniel smiled faintly. The goal was to make sure other people could keep living their stories. Then he returned his attention to the stars. Lyra said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Beyond the glass, countless lights shimmered across the galaxy. And for the first time, they seemed a little brighter. Not because a legend had finally been discovered, but because a good man had quietly reminded everyone what greatness actually looked like.